Economists, Wall Street traders, and the president regularly talk about this: America's gross domestic product. As you can see, it generally rises over time. But right now, the president and some others say it's not rising fast enough. They say the country will be better off if we can make the GDP rise at a 3% rate or even more each year, rather than the 2% rate it had been going at for a while. We'll explain why they say the current rate isn't fast enough. But first, you have to understand what GDP is and how government statisticians measure it. To put it simply, GDP is a measure of how much stuff a nation produces with all of the work that it does. All of the apples we pick from orchards, the cars we produce in factories, the dinners we serve at restaurants, the flights we take from airports, the broken legs our doctors fix in hospitals, and more. GDP is what all of that work adds up to. As a nation, we produce an enormous amount of stuff every single year. According to the Commerce Department, Americans produced nearly $21 trillion worth of goods and services last year, far more than any other nation, including China. $21 trillion. Let's put that big number in perspective. If all we did as a nation was make cars, that would be about enough car production to build 2 giant stacks of car towers to the moon in a single year. So, how does the government measure all that stuff to come up with GDP? The government's method is kind of odd. If it's a measure of how much stuff we produce as a nation, you might think that government statisticians went around counting all that production up. But that's not the way the government does it. Instead, what the government measures is everything that we consume. The thinking goes like this: what is consumed has to be produced by somebody somewhere. If you measure consumption, you can figure out production. So here's how statisticians calculate consumption. First, they count up everything that's spent by consumers. That's the stuff you buy from day to day. Then, they add it to everything that's spent by businesses on investment. That's the stuff businesses buy to grow and make what you're producing. And then, they add that to everything that's spent by the government on space travel, housing, the military, and everything else. Altogether, that equals their broad measure of everything we consume as a nation. The formula is C plus I plus G. Then, the statisticians make some adjustments. Sometimes we make goods or provide services that get sent overseas. For example, America exports a lot of soybeans. That counts toward production too, so we add that to the mix. Sometimes we also consume products that we've imported. Think about your iPhones and televisions imported from China. That's the stuff we consume that wasn't made here in America. Subtract that from the mix. Now, there's 2 other adjustments to make. Sometimes we consume stuff that was made earlier and placed in a warehouse or stuck on the shelf of a store. Think about a blouse that was placed in inventory months ago that somebody buys today. That's something we might consume today that was produced before. To adjust for these timing changes, the statisticians correct for changes in inventories. They also correct for inflation. Prices of stuff tend to go up over time, and statisticians adjust for those changes. Taken all together, you get GDP. So, what's going on now? President Trump is worried that GDP isn't growing fast enough. Between 1950 and 2000, GDP grew by 3.7% per year. That means if we produced 1,000 cars in one year, we produced 1,037 the next year and 1,075 the year after that. Since 2000, GDP has grown by 2% a year. That would mean 1,020 cars in the second year and 1,040 in the year after that. Changes in the growth rate can really add up over time. At a 3.7% growth rate, GDP doubles in 20 years. At a 2% growth rate, it takes 35 years to double. That's a long time to wait for more growth. Slower GDP growth means slower growth in family incomes, business profits, wealth, and prosperity too. That's why the president and others worry when GDP doesn't grow fast. So, how can we make it grow faster? Remember, GDP is a measure of how much our workers produce. 2 ways to make GDP grow faster are to add more workers to the labor force or to increase the productivity of the ones we've already got. Would that make us better off as a nation? Well, it would probably help a lot. But GDP isn't everything. It doesn't tell you how the income an economy produces is distributed between rich and poor. It doesn't tell you whether your air and water are clean. And it also doesn't tell you whether people are happy producing all of that stuff. That's why we need to look at a lot more than GDP to know if we're getting better off as a nation.